So good morning, everyone. Welcome to the workshop Economic Theory and Applications, and organized by our school, FGV EPGE, Escola Brasileira de Economia e Finanças. We are very pleased to have you all here today, and we'd like to thank especially our guest invited speakers, David Dillenberger, Leonardo Bursztyn, Konstantin Milbradt, Paulo Natterson, Pietro Ortoleva, and Elios Herrera. Each speaker is going to have like 45 minutes to talk, and then we have like 10 minutes Q&A. This workshop is being broadcasted, so but only the audience is allowed to make questions, right? So, Lucas, you.
Thank you, Humberto. Okay. Good morning. Thank you, Humberto, and I would like also to thank our speakers for this day, which I'm sure is going to be wonderful. And thank our students for coming, and thank you everybody who is watching from home. Let's start.
I want to invite Paulo Monteiro, who is going to be the chair of the first session.
Have 45 minutes and 5 minutes for questions. I will give you time.
Beautiful. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Let me be the first to thank the organizers. I'm sure it will be an amazing day here. So today I'm going to talk about a paper written with Pietro Ortoleva, who is here, and Simone Cherea-Vioio. It's called Caution and Reference Effects. Okay, so let me tell you what are we doing. I'll give you the bottom line, and then we'll do some details. So there are three main phenomena in behavioral economics. And one of them is the endowment effect, the idea that individuals' valuation of a good depends on whether they hold the good or not. Loss aversion, there's people refer to loss aversion in different ways, but what we think here is a rejection of symmetric bets around zero. And the certainty effect, which is a violation of expected utility in the present of a sure outcome. Now, the leading model in behavioral economics is prospect theory, and prospect theory has two layers. So the first one is there is some asymmetry between gains and losses. So the idea is that losses loom larger than gains, and this will generate both endowment effect and loss aversion. And if you want to capture the certainty effect, you add to the mix probability weighting. What we want to do here, we are going to give a new approach to study all these three phenomena jointly. They all come from the same source. And their idea would be, the story that we are going to suggest, is that individuals do not know which utility to use. They are basically unsure about their utility function or about the trade-off between goods. And they are going to solve this uncertainty with caution in the way that I'm going to make precise. And what we are going to see that this approach will allow us to generate all the three effects even if we are going to kind of tie our hands and we'll impose some symmetry, again, in a way that I will make precise, later. And then I'm going to argue that this is not just a different, conceptually different story, but also behaviorally, the two models, like these models is different from known other approaches, in particular prospect theory. There are some phenomena that we can explain and they cannot, and vice versa. If time permits, probably there will not be a lot of time, but I will also refer to the existing empirical evidence and argue how we can address it. Okay, that's the plan. If there is any question, please stop me at any time, okay? Excellent. So let me start by, here are the three phenomena of interest that we are going to discuss. The first one is the certainty effect, which is a version of a Le paradox from the 50s. What I'm showing here is known as the common ratio effect. And the idea is the following. Individuals are asked to choose between getting 3,000 for sure or a lottery that give them 4,000 with probability 0.8 and 0 otherwise. Then, and many people choose the sure amount, 3,000 for sure. Then the same individual are asked to choose between the following two prospects. One of them gives 3,000 with probability quarter and 0 otherwise, and the other gives 4,000 with probability 0.2 and 0 otherwise. And here individuals switch. They tend to choose D. Now, the choice of A and D, basically what we see is that individuals choose a sure outcome. Delta X means getting X for sure over a lottery. But when the both prospect is mixed with a common lottery, here it will be 0 with probability 0.75, individuals switch and choose the mix of the lottery. Why this is known as a Le paradox? Because this is a violation of expected utility, or the main axiom in expected utility, which is the independence axiom, that basically say if you choose A over B, you need to choose C over B. Okay, so this is the certainty effect. The endowment effect is a gap between the minimum the individual is willing to accept to give up an object that he owns, and the maximum he or she is willing to pay to acquire the same object. So the endowment effect refers to the observation that the willingness to accept always exceeds the willingness to pay. And lastly, the loss aversion, basically the first interpretation of loss aversion due to Markovich in 1952 and also in Kamen and Bursztyn in 1979 was the idea that individuals do not like symmetric bets around 0, so they will prefer to get 0 for sure over a 50-50 lottery that give them $8 or minus $8. Okay? Now, because lack of time, I'm not going to show you how this three phenomena appears in the economic literature, but you know, it's basically ideas that underline many, many phenomena. You need to believe me that they are important enough that enough people study them intensively. Another premise for today, I need to say. So this is, as I said, the main model in behavioral economics that try to address this phenomena is known as cumulative prospect theory. And this is a picture that most of you probably saw. So there is some value function. So individuals have utility that depends on whether we are in the gains domain or in the losses domain relative to some reference point. And the idea is that the utility in the losses domain is steeper than the one in the gain domain. So this is known as losses loom larger than gains. This together, and very often we assume that there is some kink or point of non-differentiability at 0. This explain loss aversion and the endowment effect. They are linked together in this model. And so if you want to capture the certainty effect, you need to add to the mix probability weighting. Okay, so this is what's the theory that we are going to refer to in the talk. And another model that I want that will be a building block of what we are doing in this paper actually is a previous paper of us, CDO for the name of the authors. It's called cautious expected utility. And in that model, we study preferences over monetary lotteries and recall the certainty effect that I just introduced earlier. Individuals prefer the sure outcome over a lottery, and then they switch to a lottery mixed with a common lottery over the sure outcome mixed with the same lottery. Suppose we want to capture this. So what we did in the other paper, we suggested an assumption that we call negative certainty expression. Basically rule out the opposite behavior. So what is the following. The sure outcome test was not enough to compensate the individual for the lottery. And say it's X. Then if you mix both with third common lottery Q and taking from X certainty appeal, then mixture of P will definitely be different. Okay, so the idea again, there is something special about having a sure outcome. So if the sure outcome is not good enough, when you take this appeal from it, it definitely will not be good enough. Okay, and what we showed in that paper is the following. So first of all, notation. So if we define CTV to be the certainty equivalent of a lottery P using the function V, that is the prize such that the value of this prize equal to the expected value of the lottery, expected utility of the lottery, then the result that we show is the following, that the preferences over money satisfy very basic assumptions and negative certainty independence. Can be, if the binary relation, the preference relation satisfy that, then it can be represented as follows. There is a set of utility functions over money, with W, such that the value of each lottery is the following. The individual compute the certainty effect of the lottery with respect to every utility in the set and pick the smallest one. Okay? In expected utility, we have one utility function. Here we have a set of utility functions, and the value of the lottery is the smallest certainty equivalent. And there are two layers here. So individuals have multiple utility or multiple possible evaluations. Okay? And he or she uses quotient to select. And again, one way to think about it, I'm asking you what is your value of the lottery that gives 0 with probability half or 1,000 with probability half. To say what is the certainty. Yes. Yes. This is the representation. So the theorem will say this axiom is an only if there is a set such that. Okay? And yes, so the idea is the following. You ask your lottery, half, 1,000, 0. Ask what is the certainty equivalent. If you ask me, I would say, well, unclear, definitely below 500, above 200. I would say something between 300 and 400. But when you ask me, okay, so how much would you pay for the lottery? I would say, in that case, 300. So again, I have a range of possible evaluations, but when I need to value, I take always the most pessimist or the most cautious interpretation. Okay? So in this model, individuals have, it's different from probability weighting in the sense that they take probabilities in face time. Okay, so this was also already a preface to what's coming next, and now let's dig into what I'm going to discuss today. Okay? So we're going to have bundles in RK. Think about it as money, mugs, pens. Dimension 1 will always be money. And since we are interested in reference effect, our interpretation will be that all will be relative changes with respect to a given reference point. So if Y is the final allocation and R is the reference bundle, then I'm going to view the bundle as the difference Y minus R. Okay, so all will be changes relative to the reference point. We're going to have preferences over lottery over bundles and some notation. So E sub I will be the canonical vector. That means that for any number A, AEI will be the vector that gives 0 in every dimension, but in the ith dimension where it gives A. For any function V over bundles, let me define the CPV now to be the monetary equivalent of this lottery. That is, the amount Z such that getting Z money, Z dollars, and 0 otherwise, the value of this bundle equal to the expected utility of the lottery. Okay? And sometime I'm writing delta X, sometime X, to refer to a lottery that gives the bundle X research. Here will be our cautious utility, and you see it's an extension of the previous model. That's why I spent some time on remind you or introduce you the previous paper. So now, again, the individual will have a set of increasing and continuous utility functions. They are all normalized, so that V of 0 is 0. 0 is here, getting 0 everywhere. This is the reference point. Such that the monetary equivalent exists, and preferences are represented as, again, the value of a lottery will be the minimum or the smallest monetary equivalent of a lottery, smallest computed with respect to every utility in the set. Okay? And since we would like, our point will be that what will drive all the phenomena we're interested in is the aggregation, the cautious, that it come with the inf or the mean aggregator. We can think about a different model when we call incautious, for the lack of a better name, in which the aggregator, rather than the inf, you take the soup or the mass. And I will refer to it later. Okay? So far so good? Excellent. So let me give you, here are the three, again, the certainty effect I already discussed. Let me give you a bit more formally what we mean by the endowment effect and loss aversion. So the willingness to pay is the maximum the individual is willing to pay to get m units of item I. That is, this is the amount such that staying in the status quo, or in the endowment, or in the reference point, that is getting 0 everywhere, it's indifferent to receiving m units in dimension I and paying this amount of money. Okay, the amount WTPIM, call it Z, that make this indifferent, we call it the willingness to pay to get this m units of item I. The willingness to accept is the minimum you're willing to accept to sell m units of item I. Again, you want to be indifferent between not do anything, which is 0, giving up m units of item I, and receiving this amount of dollars. And we say that the preference relation exhibits the endowment effect if for any good I, the willingness to accept always exceed the willingness to pay. Okay, this will be our definition, or this is the definition of the endowment effect. Loss aversion, we say that individual is loss averse in dimension I if what? He prefer not to do anything, that is to get 0 for sure, over participating in a 50-50 lottery, which give him M with probability half, or minus M with probability. Yes, please. Yes, so one thing that we are interested in is talk about things like the endowment effect. The endowment effect is about trade-off between money and mouths. This is something that we couldn't discuss even in the previous paper.
Across the goods also, you're going to play with that? Or?
Absolutely. 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 And you see here that I have EI and E1. It will be actually the key. Okay? Okay. Before I'll give you the main result, by the way, I try to be not too ambitious. I'm going to give you a result, then we work out an example that will be super simple, but it will be very, very generic. And if you get this example, I'm happy. Okay? That will be the goal of today. And if there will be some time, I will add some more stuff. But okay. So as I said earlier, usually these phenomena stem, at least in the behavioral literature, from some asymmetry in the utility function, that losses loom larger than gains. Now, we don't have anything against asymmetry, but we want to give you a new channel, to suggest a new channel that drive this result. And we want to say that we can do it, that it doesn't rely on asymmetry. That is, even if we want to tie our hands and to impose symmetry in a well-defined sense, and to show that even if we must be symmetric, we still generate. It all comes from the quotient interpretation rather than asymmetry. Okay? So that's our reason to impose symmetry. So what do we mean? So let me define f bar of, for any function f bar of x to be minus f of minus x. A function f is odd if f equal to f bar. That's the definition of an odd function. We would say that a set of utilities is odd if whenever f is in the set, so it's a specular function. So a set is odd clearly if all functions are odd, but if there is function that is not odd, is specular is also in the set. In that sense, we are kind of build symmetry inside the model. Okay? And symmetric cautious utility will be cautious utility where the set of utilities is odd. And again, I want to emphasize we focus on symmetric cautious utility to highlight the role of quotient even under symmetry. Okay? Okay, so that's the main result I want to discuss today. And it says the following. If you take a relation, preference relation, that have a symmetric cautious utility representation, then it satisfies the endowment effect and is loss averse. If you have incautious utility, which is the opposite, then you are the opposite of the endowment effect, and you are gain seeking. Okay, so the symmetric cautious utility, we already know capture the certainty effect. That's also, for this we don't need this paper, this from our previous paper. What we add here to the mix, that is the exact same idea also leads to these two phenomena, even under symmetry.
This is not an equivalence result, right? So it's just an implication here, right? So So it's not true that A and B hold, then you have a symmetric false-shows representation for.
Oh, of course not, in the sense that you can be cautious, you can be cumulative prospect theory in satisfied. So you just say, if you have this, then we have this. We have an equivalent, some axiomatization of the functional form, but that I'm not going to discuss today. What we say that this model generates the three phenomena from one source. Yeah? Again, we are not the only model that can get it, but we can. And the key here is that if you take the incautious utility, you get the exact one. So it's all about the quotient aggregate. That's the key. Okay? So let me try to illustrate what's going on with a simple example. And the simple example, it's very simple. But the surprising thing that is super generic. If you understand this, you understand the paper. Okay? By the way, how much time do I have? 45 minutes total, but now? Ooh, 25 minutes. We can go to see Copacabana and back. Okay, so let's understand this example. Suppose we have two dimensions. Money is first dimension and the second dimension is facts. And let me write, and suppose the set W has two utility functions. Let's look at the simplest two utility I can write. Symmetric and linear. So the first one, the value of a bundle x1, x2 is x1 plus x2. And the other is x1 plus 2x2. What does it mean? It means that according to the first utility, a mug worth $1, and according to the other utility, a mug worth $2. Okay? Let's calculate together the willingness to pay. This is the amount Z, such that, staying in the reference point, not do anything, which is the bundle 0, 0. The individual is indifferent between that and giving up $Z and getting M max. Okay? So the value of 0, 0 is the minimum between 0 and 0, it's just 0. Now here the utilities are linear, so I don't need to do any inverse to get the certainty equivalent. So let's just do that. What is the value of losing Z, giving up $Z and getting M mag? Is the minimum between what? According to the first utility, it is minus Z plus M. According to the second utility, it's minus Z plus 2M. Since you have a cautious utility, you take always the minimum interpretation. It will be minus Z plus M. Therefore, I want them to be equivalent, indifferent. So 0 equal to minus Z plus M, which tell us that the willingness to pay for M units of item 2 is M. So far, so good? Let's move to the willingness to accept. This is the number, the amount of money R, such that you are indifferent between 0, 0 and receiving R dollars and giving up the M mags that you have. What is now the value of R minus M? Well, according to the first utility, it is R minus M. According to the second utility, is R minus 2M. These are linear utilities, so you just plug the values. I take the minimum one, which is R minus 2M. So therefore, R is the amount such 0, the value of this bundle, equal to the value of this bundle, which give us that the willingness to accept is 2M. hallelujah. What we have? We have that the willingness to accept 2M is greater than M, which is the willingness to pay, which is exactly the endowment effect. So what's going on here? Let's try to kind of see the intuition. Suppose you are holding the good and you are selling it. The worst thing for you is that you are selling a good thing, like a peach, right? When you are buying an object, the worst interpretation for you that you are buying a lemon. Okay? And therefore you will willing to pay less when you buy the object, because the worst that you get a bad quality. When you pay, when you sell, you're afraid that you are giving up something good and you will ask more. And this uncertainty about the trade-off, uncertainty about how much a mug worth for you, that generates the endowment. If you understand that, that's the paper. Konstantin.
I'm a bit uncertain here. The example where you just give me the interpretation is, it's a peach or it's a lemon, but it's all about your utility. It's not about the, there's no uncertainty about the good that you're receiving. Is that correct? I'm just trying to understand, like, you're perfectly certain what the good is and what the quality of the good is, but you're uncertain about your utility. Is that correct?
You understand your utility about, you're uncertain about utility, which means you are uncertain about the trade-offs.
Exactly. You're
How much
uncertain
it
about
worth for you?
Exactly. You're uncertain about the trade-offs, but you're not uncertain that whatever mug you're getting is a crappy mug or a good mug.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. So there's no equivalence to an uncertainty about the actual quality of the good.
Yes. Yes.
I just wanted to clarify. Thank you.
Yes. It's all your interpretation of what side you are. Okay. So very good. So I would like to argue that this is holding much more general. So quick result would say, okay, so what I want to say that this example, although it's very simple, it's basically the norm rather than the exception. So let me say it a bit more formally. Suppose for each V, again, I have a set of utility function, and for each V in the set, I can compute the willingness to accept and willingness to pay with respect to this V in the set. And you can show that the willingness to accept for good I, basically, the individual calculate the willingness to accept with respect to every utility in the set, and it's the maximum one, and the willingness to pay is the minimum one. Okay? So basically, since you're cautious, you pick the opposite end of the range. If W is odd, then basically it's the same range. And now you understand there is a range of values. The willingness to accept is always the highest. The willingness to pay is always the smallest. And therefore, once we have a range, which is not a point, we get the willingness to accept, we get the endowment effect in strict way. This is the result. You will have a strict endowment effect as long as there is at least two utility functions in the set that disagree in their willingness to accept or disagree in their willingness to pay. In that sense, as long as the set is not degenerate, we have the endowment effect hold distinctly. Okay, in that sense, the result, the example that I suggested was very general. Okay? In Econ 101, remember we have indifference curves. Basically, I can say that, and we can think about the notion of marginal rate of substitution. The endowment effect, if there is a doubt about the marginal rate of substitution between money and goods. Okay? Good. Now, you may ask, how about loss aversion? Note that in the example that I gave, is both utilities were symmetric, and if you do the computation, you see that actually there is no loss aversion. But that means that in the Gaussian utility model, the endowment effect is decoupled from loss aversion. We can have the endowment effect without loss aversion. We can have loss aversion without the endowment effect. We can have both. In fact, we are going to have strict loss aversion if and only if at least one utility in the set is not symmetric. Okay? Now, let me use this opportunity to also give some preface to Pietro's talk later today, why we think this is an interesting property of the model. Because there is some evidence to remember, we want now to relate it to empirical evidence, and one thing is about the relation between loss aversion and the endowment effect. So remember that in cumulative prospect theory, the two go hand in hand together, they are linked, because both come from loss aversion. And therefore they should be correlated. And indeed, there is some evidence that they are correlated, but there is also some evidence against it. A lot of recent evidence, Pietro probably will tell us something about it later on, that basically show that when you look at big population, actually they found lack of correlation between loss aversion and the endowment effect. So this is something that the model can address. This is something that multi-prospect theory cannot accommodate. Okay? And conceptually, that are related, but they come from two different sources. So the endowment effect, it's come because you have doubts on the marginal relative substitution between money and the object. Loss aversion, I didn't give you the example because of lack of time. It's about kind of doubt about how to aggregate against them in some way. Okay, let me conclude with a brief remark, and then I will not talk about axiomatization, all this, and then I will just open for questions, okay? So as I said, our point is not to say, we're not going to run a horse race between models, but just want to ask you to look at a different way to view phenomena that are widely used and well known, and to show and to suggest that they come from a different view. Okay, rather than asymmetry and probability weighting, it comes from a multiple utilities and exercise costs. As I said, there are some phenomena, so this is more than just being a different story. There is a testable way to test the difference between the two models. So there are some phenomena that our model allow and give difficulties to other popular models, with particular cumulative prospect theory. There is something that's known as the violation of gain-loss separability, some stake dependence of non-expected utility, for example, Allais paradox with bigger amount of money but disappear when a small amount of money, preferences for randomization. There are some phenomena that prospect theory can accommodate and we cannot. For example, what they call the four-fold pattern. Again, I'm not going into details. The most important thing is the following, that these two models are completely distinct. So we have a result that says that if you have a preference relation that admits a symmetric cautious utility, without redundant utilities, that is, that all the utilities in the set can be active somewhere, if you have both this representation and cumulative prospect theory representation, then you boil down to expected utility, one utility function which is loss neutral, and no endowment effect. That is, cumulative prospect theory and cautious utility are fully distinct. I think for today this will be enough. I will be happy to answer, I don't know what the time, but I will be happy to answer any questions.
Lot of time for questions.
Even better. Please don't be shy.
So, how does the explanation of this gap in your model relates to the explanation using the income effect?
Very good. So, the income effect, okay, so I would say that we don't have income effect in the model, but the way I read the evidence, when people talk about the endowment effect, they basically they argued in most of the experiments that it's not because of the endowment effect. And the way to do it, they ask the sellers to give their evaluation, the buyers to give their evaluation, and then people outsiders just to say their, we call it the choosers. And the choosers just to give their evaluation, and in terms of income, they are identical to the sellers, but we show that the gap in the sellers is much larger. The gap between willingness to accept and willingness to pay is much larger than of the choosers. So I think that there is kind of accepted in the experimental or empirical literature that the income effect is not what driven the phenomena, and we abstract from it.
So to me, this is similar to max-min expected utility, but instead of like you being uncertain about the probability or uncertain about the value, is there some kind of like relation or equivalence? Like, you have a set of value functions, you have a set of priors that expect the utility the same.
Beautiful. So let me ask you to go back. I'll give you the answer, but before that, I'll say all these answers appear in the previous paper, okay? And the story is the following. Yes. So he asked whether there is, let me just rephrase, okay, to put everyone on the same place. So he says, look, you have the value of a lottery is the minimum of a set of utility function, and in the world of risk, in the world of ambiguity, there is the known model of Milbradt and Schmeidler, in which the individual have a set of beliefs, of probabilities, and they take the minimum expected utility, right? Okay. So, first of all, the models are very related. I would argue that in some well-defined sense, this model is the risk equivalent of max-min expected utility. And the way we formalize it, and again, we are going back something that we did in the previous paper, you can show that both models can be generated from some cautious completion of incomplete preference relation. Okay? So what do we mean? It means that you can think about an incomplete relation, that you have a set of evaluation, a set of utility function, and you say that if lottery P is preferred to lottery Q, if all the utilities in the set refer P to Q, okay? But now you impose on it cautious negative certainty independence, and you show that this generates the mean aggregator. You can do the similar exercise, in fact, not you can do. people did it in 2008, Gilboa, Schmeidler, Macaron, and Marinacci, and showed that max-min expected utility can be generated from a similar intuition from a model when you have a set of priors, and one act F is referred to G.
Set of what? I'm sorry, I didn't understand that.
What?
A set of what? You just said a set of.
A set of priors or probabilities such that you prefer an act. It's a different domain, yes? Act F to act G. If all the expected utility with respect to all the priors of F exceed that of G, if you impose something, they call it default to certainty, which is essentially our negative certainty independence, turned out, then you saw that the completion give you max-min expected utility. So in that sense, this model is the risk analog of max-min expected utility under ambiguity, and it's very important to have the certainty equivalent here and not the expected utility.
Like the behaviorally, they are similar, but psychologically, they are different in the sense that in one you don't know your prior, in the other you don't know your value. But can you like devise an experiment to separate the two theories?
This is a different domain, right? In here the probabilities are given. Again, these are different models, they live in a different world, right? Here the probabilities are given, so they are there. It's a different objects.
Okay.
Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Guys, we have 10 minutes. In 10 minutes, we're coming back. Thanks.
Ei, e. Aumenta mais um pouco. Ei, e. Ei, e. Isso. Variou. E o outro microfone.
Tá bom o volume para você?
So let's restart. So we're pleased to have Leo Bursztyn now. Leo, you have like 45 minutes.
Okay, perfect. Perfect. We're happy. Hello. Okay. It's not used to, doing. So this paper is called Justifying Dissent. So thank you for having me today. It's a pleasure. This is joint work with Georgi Egorov from Northwestern, Ingar Halan from Bergen, Akash Rao, who's a PhD student at Harvard, and Chris Roth from Cologne. So let's get started. So I don't know what the protocol is today, but if you have questions throughout, feel free to interrupt. So the motivation of this paper is pretty simple. If you look throughout history, dissent is a powerful force both for and against social change. And when you think, studying the context of dissent, many times rationales that could be supplied by political entrepreneurs, social movements, and the media often enable dissent by shaping the public debate. Okay? Just to pick a couple of recent examples, just where things have been salient in the political debate, on both sides of the political aisle, narratives that the police reform would increase violent crime have been used and disseminated to justify the opposition to the view that there should be police reform in the U.S. On the other side, among Republicans and conservative circles, people have relied and disseminated rationales and narratives that immigrants are violent criminals to justify like opposing some types of immigration into the U.S. Okay, so just a couple examples of types of rationales that have been supplied and disseminated. Now the question is, why is it that these rationales facilitate or enable dissent? Okay, so the standard explanation, the standard account is a story of persuasion. I, had some opinion, and then I'm exposed to a rationale, some argument, and that changes my opinion. Perhaps I was supportive of immigration, and then I see some argument, some rationale that immigrants are criminals. That changes my mind. So I'll be more likely to express my dissent because I have been persuaded. Okay? Standard persuasion channel. But if you look at the data, dissent is often limited not due to a lack of support for the cause, but rather by people's fear of the consequences of expressing dissent. Okay, so if you look at recent survey data in the U.S., for example, 62% of Americans agree with the statement that the political climate these days prevents me from saying things I believe because others might find them offensive. Okay, so it seems that there's something beyond the lack of support for some causes, and rather also about, conditional holding your opinion, you kind of a discomfort expressing it publicly because of the political climate. Okay. So what we're going to study here is that we're going to propose and experimentally examine another mechanism, a mechanism of social cover, okay, by which rationales affect public behavior. So I'm going to motivate this with a couple examples, which are the ones I mentioned before, just to, to fix ideas. Think about the opposition to defunding the police, okay? So in many settings, mostly in liberal circles, there are large social sanctions from expressing this view, okay? So, people might think that if you say, I don't think we should reform the police, or I don't think we should defund the police, people might attribute this position, your lack of support at this position, to a lack of support for racial equality. Say, Leo is against it, he doesn't support racial equality, Leo's a racist, or something like that, okay? Now, suppose that there's an argument that's popularized claiming that the police defunding will increase violent crime, okay? So there's an argument and people are exposed to it. Now, people may now publicly oppose defunding the police due to, one, persuasion, right? People's private opposition to defunding becomes stronger. Well, I changed my mind. This is a good argument. So I'm willing to pay the social cost. I'm more likely to be willing to pay the social cost because kind of my opinion has changed. I feel more strongly about this. There could be a mechanism of anticipated persuasion. You think that some of your audience will be persuaded, and this will shape your social cost. Like, okay, that didn't really change my mind. I already was supportive of, I was already opposing defunding the police, but now I know that some other people will be persuaded, and that's going to change my calculus of the social cost, right? I'm going to be judged less harshly. Some people might be persuaded. Yes?
How should I be thinking about like this the private type of forums, let's say anonymous, Econ Job Market, Reddit, and so on, where the cost is kind of minimal,
yes,
and you can go ahead and say.
Yes, exactly. I'm thinking about public expression of dissent, right? For example, and actually a lot of the work experiments are going to be on Twitter, right, where things are less anonymous. But you're right. When you're thinking about more anonymous forums where people don't even know who you are, some of these things, the next one are going to be less relevant, right? And it's going to be, yes, but a lot of expression is observed, right? A lot of actions are observed. If you want to join, sign a petition, you want to go out there and express your opinion, or you want to speak in a one-on-one conversation, you want to join a political protest, many things are observed, right? And then we have the social cover mechanism here, which is the rationale opens up new explanation for their position, reduces informativeness of the position to be funding, at least for the underlying type. So the idea here is that if I say this, people don't know that I've been exposed to a rationale, they're going to update on my type. They say, okay, he must be against racial equality. Now, if people know that I've been exposed to an argument, they say, well, maybe he was persuaded by this argument. Maybe he has a good reason to oppose it. I'll give him a pass. I'll change my inference about this person's type. So there's less informativeness of opposition itself for the underlying prejudice. Okay?
So do you have any model behind your mind? So like a social norm thing, you're sitting right.
Yeah.
You just say that, but you're gonna rely on some modeling to think of.
I'm not talking about the model today because for the interest of time and frankly, the contribution I think is mostly experimental. Yes, there's a model. You can think about that social signaling model where people make inference about your type, conditional observing your action. I'm gonna go through all type of framework, and then the informativeness of the action to infer your type is changed when you introduce kind of a rationale that people know you've been exposed to. So it's just changing the inference there. Some people have been persuaded by it, so there's a chance that you were one of them, right? So people are given a pass. So that's for the example on the liberal side. I think about a similar example on the conservative side. It's going to be quick here because it's very similar. In some settings you might face sanctions for saying that you oppose immigration or express anti-minority views. People might think of you as a xenophobe or as a racist. Now suppose that there's an argument that is popularized claiming that immigrants commit more violent crime. Again, this might facilitate dissent for a number of reasons, including the social cover. People say, oh, maybe they believe this argument, maybe they're persuaded, maybe they're really worried about crime, maybe they're not just racist, right? So it could actually serve as a social cover. So what we're going to study here is that we're going to run a number of experiments. I'm not going to have time to go through all of them. We have a total of 17 experiments we ran in this paper, and most of them on social media. And these experiments study the power and limitations of rationales in facilitating dissent. So I'm going to study on the liberal side their willingness to publicly oppose the movement to defund the police, and on the conservative side, their willingness to publicly support the immediate deportation of all illegal Mexican immigrants. Okay, so I'm going to study these two positions and see what's going on both sides of the political aisle. We're going to isolate the social cover effect of rationales from these other mechanisms and other profounds, and we'll demonstrate its quantitative importance in the setting of social media. We also going to study the other side, the observer side, saying we show both how social cover facilitates the expression of dissent, but also how this changes the observer's inference about the motives behind dissent. Okay, so we're going to do experiments on the other side of communication too. Okay, so since this is a shorter talk, I'm just going to go quickly here. I'm going to start with some experiments on the liberal side, both in terms of the expression of dissent and the interpretation of dissent by receivers in the model, by observers, and do the same thing on the conservative side. And then I'm going to show you, if you have time, a bunch of additional experiments with larger representative samples, and we can conclude and discuss some of the policy implications and extensions and so on. I think there are quite a few. All right. So this is an experiment that was all pre-registered and ran in October of last year, and with a sample of just over 500 Democrats and independents with active Twitter accounts. Okay, so this is on the liberal side, okay? And social media is a natural setting to study dissent for a number of reasons. There's a natural audience, your followers, your friends, so people that you might care about, and it's natural audience. This is also a natural form of public expression. People just post tweets, they write things on Facebook and so on. There's a number of readily available rationales that people naturally use. They can repost, retweet, they can tag, or just add a link or so on. And it's a setting of direct interest, right? As a lot of the public debate these days is on social media, and there's a lot of concerns about what's going on, what the policy implications are, so I think it's a setting of direct interest. So how do we actually study this? Because, we wanted to do something that was more compelling than just asking people something, oh, do you support this, and so on. And, we wanted it to be public, and we wanted it to be somewhat natural, okay? So, but we wanted to, therefore, to have a revealed preference measure of the willingness to publicly dissent, okay? So, our measure was a person's willingness to post a tweet expressing support for a campaign opposing defunding the police, okay? Now, we faced a challenge here because we wanted this to be reviewed preference, actually something that resembles an actual decision with real costs, but we also we didn't want to actually contribute to start a political campaign. We just didn't want to get a bunch of people to start posting something and maybe create a whole campaign on Twitter. That wouldn't be like ideal in terms of ethics, right? So we had to work around that, and our solution was, instead of asking people to post something, we asked them to download an app that we created. It has a pretty shitty name, Tweetability, which, you know, doesn't matter. And so they download this app when they join the experiment, and this app allows us to schedule a post on their Twitter account on their behalf. So they had to authorize us, you know, to post this tweet, right? And I'll describe a little bit more. Sorry. This is moving. Yes. Well, they could say no. You know, it's an outcome. Well, they're paid to participate in the experiment. Yes, yes, yes. So we asked them to post this tweet. And what we did is we said, all the tweets will be posted when and if we reach survey respondents in all counties, okay? Now, this is a condition that we knew we were never going to reach because we knew we were going to survey about 500 people, and there are more than 500 counties in the US. So this is a condition that we, the researchers, knew we were not going to be able to reach, but the participants didn't know. So there is a tension here. There's some... I'll wait for...
Working? Yes? Okay. I just probably I missed when you said it. But what about the situation? I don't care at all about that. But I know that if I will not, basically not tweeting anything, it means like tweeting the opposite.
I see. So
because again, I hear these are random people, but you know, I go all the, you see these groups, everybody know everyone, they try to enforce one another, and I feel if I will not do, I'm expected to do that. You miss this here when you have a random sample of people.
Yeah, I mean, we're giving people the opportunity to make a statement in something, but no one knows that you had the opportunity, right? There's no, and you stayed silent, for example. Yes, so we don't have this by design. I agree with you. I think it's super interesting, actually, how do people interpret silence, right? In fact, I was trying to run some experiments on WhatsApp. It was like, if you stay quiet, how are people going to interpret your silence and so on? I think that's an interesting question.
Precisely because of that. I don't want to play this game, but I think that's what's going on.
But I think it's part of what's going on. I agree with you. So basically here, we told them that this will be posted if we reach this condition. Participants did not know that this condition was a condition we're not hoping or planning to reach. And we told them they will be deleted if not yet posted by a certain date, okay? So if we don't reach this target. Okay, so eventually, so no tweet was posted. You know, they were not told about that. Okay, so every participant was provided with a rationale. So the rationale was an article written by a Princeton criminology professor arguing that defunding the police increases violent crime. So this is a piece that was published in the Washington Post, an opinion piece by this Princeton criminology professor showing the data, okay, about the scientific consensus that defunding the police increases violent crime. Now, this is a very, very good rationale, very credible. This is by a professor at Princeton criminology professor on the Washington Post, which is a pretty liberal outlet with scientific evidence, right? Our paper? No, it's not a co-author.
So you're lying to them.
No, it's a real article. I'll show you I'll show you it.
Oh, I thought you were gonna write it. Okay,
No, I'll show you. So after showing this, it's a link with the actual published article, like in the Washington Post. And then after they see it, they choose whether to privately join a campaign, right, to oppose defunding the police. So they showed it, and they make the private action. Those who join the article, who join the campaign are shown the article a second time, okay? Then choose, after seeing the second time, whether or not to post a tweet with a petition to oppose defunding the police. Now, I'm going to show our experimental manipulation, which is varying the ability of social cover, holding all the other mechanisms constant. How do we do this? Well, we need to fix both persuasion and anticipated persuasion across treatments. Okay. Every person saw the article. So persuasion is held fixed because you show the article to every person, right? And anticipated persuasion is also constant there, because in both versions of the tweet that we asked them to post, you have the link to the article, right? So they saw the article, they know the audience will see the article. The only thing that varies is whether the tweet communicates that the respondent was exposed to the rationale before or after joining the campaign. Both things are true because they're shown the article twice, okay? So that was the trick we did here. So the experiment is basically people randomized into the cover condition or the no cover condition. The cover condition reads, I have joined the campaign to oppose defunding the police, and that's a link to joining campaign. Before joining, I was shown this article written by a Princeton professor on the strong scientific evidence that defunding the police would increase violent crime, okay? This one is the exact same wording we said after joining instead of before joining. I was shown this article written by a Princeton professor. It's the only difference. Everything else is held constant. You were shown the article, your audience will see it. The only difference is the audience in one case thought that you saw it before, you joined, in the other case that you saw it after. That's the only manipulation we have, this one word, okay? And then just to start showing some results. This is a willingness to tweet by group, okay? So people who have the language that you saw it after you joined, 57% of them actually authorized the tweet. This is conditioned on being someone who already privately joined the campaign, okay? So 57% actually authorized the tweet. Now, if you change this one word, providing them kind of a plausible deniability or social cover, this grows to about 70%. So we have a significant increase, substantial even, and you know, if anything's a lower bound because it's just one word. If they're not paying attention, you know, they're not going to catch that. Okay, so that's the first result that we have. Of course, a bunch of issues you could say. Well, could people be more willing to schedule the cover tweet due to some mechanical effects of before or after wording? Do they think that the after wording is weird? I don't like to post this. It makes me look like I'm someone who doesn't check things and, you know, I'm not informed. So we ran a placebo experiment with identical manipulation in a non-stigmatized domain and showed that there is no mechanical effect of the wording of before and after. I'll show you in a sec. Are they also potentially more willing to schedule the cover tweet because they anticipate that the before wording will be more persuasive to followers? They say, well, this is a better tweet. I will convince more people with that. It's just a better type of tweet. I'll be more likely to post it. We showed that that's not the case with an auxiliary experiment where we asked people to predict the persuadability of the two types of tweets. We also collect direct evidence on the social cover mechanism by actually asking people in the different sample which versions of these different tweets they would choose and why. And then we just like do text analysis and hand code their open-ended answers. And we showed that a lot of people actually mention unprompted aspects of social cover. Okay, just to get a kind of an additional thing. So just to give you an example of the placebo experiment, we ran the same experiment with a separate sample. And instead of being about defunding the police, it's about conserving the Amazon rainforest, okay? With a rationale, with some landmark research studies suggesting that many species are in danger of extinction. And what we find here is that we don't find that there is like a much bigger willingness to tweet when you have the cover. So it doesn't seem that there's something just mechanical going on from the wording, right? Also interesting to note that the baseline level is 83% here instead of 57. So, which indicates that indeed there could be some stigma going on because condition on holding an opinion privately, you're much more likely to actually be willing to express it publicly here than in the other stigmatized setting, which is another way to show that there was some stigma going on there too. Okay, but here, importantly, we don't see this effect. We also ask people presented with one of the two versions of the tweet, and we ask them to guess what share of their followers will be persuaded to join the campaign if they saw the two versions. And we don't see any difference. So we don't think that they anticipate that one version of the tweet is just more persuasive toward the audience and therefore something that should be more likely to tweet. So we don't think this is driving the results. As I said, since it's short here, there's a lot of work that was put into this on how to get people in an unprompted way to mention the reasons why they will pick a tweet over the other without making it obvious, the choice. I can discuss this during Q&As, because this just would take a lot of time. But we definitely need a lot of work on this with hand coding and responses, also text analysis. My co-authors like to do that kind of stuff. So just all I want to say here is that a lot of people in a completely unprompted way, mentioned the social cover mechanism, and substantially more likely to have mentioned it in the cover treatment. Okay. So, but I'll leave that for later. Okay. So now the receiver side, because our story is that the reason why this works is because the observer changes their inference about your motives and also their judgment, right? So what we did here is that we ran an experiment, again, a pre-registered experiment, also last year, with about 1,000 Democrats, which we think are the people who would be judging you for opposing the defunding of the police. And each respondent was matched with a previous survey participant from the previous experiment who chose to post a tweet opposing defunding the police. And the experiment here is very simple. We showed one of the two versions of the tweet, right? The person you match with did this, posted this, or wanted to post this, or the person you matched this was willing to post this one. So one of the two, right? So that's a simple, just a screenshot, nothing else, okay? Very simple. And then we have three outcomes. One is how you judge that person. Your willingness to deny a bonus payment to that participant. You're just burning money. You really don't want them to get more money, okay? So you're punishing them. Another one is an inference about their motives. So we asked them, what do you think is the probability that they donated money to this organization that helps the black cause in the US, okay? So, and then we also asked them, why do you think that person donated to that joined that campaign? So, and we use open-ended text analysis, just unprompted, right? Here's what we find. This is the willingness to deny the bonus payment. So when the other person, participant, had posted the tweet without the cover, the liberal here in this experiment, about 47% of them burned the money, don't want the other person to get the bonus payment, okay? It's not like I'm trading money for me versus money for them. It's just like, I just don't want that person to get money, okay? This number goes down to 39.7%. So we can see some movement, you know. Some people start giving them more of a pass just because they have posted a tweet. Before posting, they were exposed to the article as opposed to after. Note that needs a lot of sophistication. You need to read the tweet and anticipate that the other person. But we're still able to capture the effect. Then when we look at the other outcome that we pre-registered, is like, what do you think is the probability that that person made a donation to a pro-black organization? The absence of the cover is pretty low, 27%, okay? Here it goes up to 34.5%. So your inference about whether that person supports black causes in the US also changes, consistent with our mechanism in mind of changing interpretation about their motives. We also, and I'm going to skip here because it takes a lot of time and text analysis, we also show that they're much more likely, when you ask them, why do you think that person donates, they're much less likely to mention words associated with opposition to racial equality or racism and tolerance, and much more likely to use words associated with concerns about crime and so on. So people seem to be shifting their influence in their mind, even with open-ended ones. Now, the availability of social cover therefore changes the willingness to public dissent, but also judgment and inference, right? Now, the interesting thing is that most Democrats actually oppose defunding the police right now, right? Yet, they don't seem to be willing to express it, right? So there's a case in which kind of vocal minorities might be shaping the debate, right? So the question is that we started getting excited about, like, just how difficult it is to justify dissent in the setting. How high needs to be the bar for you to be able to say it without people thinking that, oh no, you're racist. You know, you're saying this, you're against racial equality and so on. How bar? We use something with very high bar, like, this is pretty credible. A Princeton criminology professor in the Washington Post, which is a liberal outlet, using this strong scientific evidence. So we said, let's start to reduce the bar a little bit. Let's see when it stops working. So we reduced it just a little bit. We ran a separate experiment on the inference side where we asked people, we showed the same experiment, but we showed them two different versions here. We said, oh, that person posted this tweet saying that they joined the campaign, and we said, before joining, I was shown this article that argues that defunding the police would increase violent crime. We removed Princeton professor, we removed scientific evidence. We keep the article fixed, by the way. We just made it seem a little less scientific, a little less credible, right? And here's what we find. doesn't work anymore. So if you're using the same Washington Post article, but you cannot, if you're not saying that it's scientific evidence by a Princeton professor, it doesn't seem people still judge you. It doesn't work anymore, okay? Both here and both in terms of beliefs about a donation to a pro-black organization. So it seems, at least based on this setting here, that the bar is very high on the liberal side. That you, if you want to say something that goes against kind of more the woke crowd, you better have a really good argument, a really scientific evidence, because otherwise, they're going to judge you. Yes?
No, suppose, just about framing, suppose you write it, beliefs about donation to anti-black organizations. What will happen then? Just the frame of this thing.
Yeah, no, yes. So here is we could have done that, right? This is like...
I may be that there is some, supporting something and being against something will, against immigration rather than pro-immigration. So will it change something?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we haven't done that. Could be. We tried different approaches, right? We also tried the open-ended
Because it may be
text.
that it leads, the name leads to your answer somehow, right? Maybe not. I don't know.
Yeah, we haven't done, the belief that they're actually... Yeah, could be true. We did that this way. Could have done the other way. I think the open-ended text also helps because it's unprompted, and we ask them, why do you think they made the donation? And what comes to mind is consistent with our story. But you're right. We framed this as donation to a pro-black organization. Therefore, that's why the take-up is pretty low, right?
That when you write it, you already put it out. Anti-black organizations. So people say, oh my gosh, and now suddenly they're more freer to say something.
Yeah.
Rather than, I don't want to be the raise this.
Yeah. But this is, again, this was not the outcome, right? This is just your belief about whether that person made that donation, right? But, that's not the outcome from the previous one because the original experiment was actually joining a campaign against defunding the police, right? So it was already framed in your way. This is just, we did this for the instance about the side. So then we also did the whole thing on the Republican side. In fact, it started like that, but then we decided, to add the liberal side. So I'll be very quick here because it's a very similar experiment. But here the outcome is we were asked to tweet a petition to immediately deport all illegal Mexican immigrants. So kind of strong stance against undocumented immigrants. And the rationale, instead of a Princeton criminology professor, we use the equivalent among Republicans, which is Tucker Carlson, okay? So the Fox News anchor with a video discussing the link between illegal immigration and crime, okay? Could be. You'll see this definitely works for conservatives. So the experiment is very similar. There's a cover condition and no cover condition. The only difference here is that instead of showing the video twice, everyone sees the video first, but everyone, and we vary whether they get, and then we ask them if they want to join the campaign. Some people get the link to the video before they join, and some people after. It's just the link. The timing of the link varies, right? So the first version says, before I joined the campaign, I received a link to this video about how illegals commit more crime. And this one, after I joined the campaign, I received a link to this video, right? I mean, both things are true. They all saw the video before, but the link was sent either before or after. So it's a way to imply that they saw the video before or after, okay? And we use the Tucker Carlson video. And here's what we find. A pretty big effect of being able to evoke that you saw, that you were exposed to Tucker Carlson before you made the decision. The take-up here without the cover is 48%. So this condition on joining the campaign privately, 48% are willing to tweet, and this goes to 65% once they can say that they saw this video with Tucker Carlson before, right? It's a pretty big effect of being able to say that you were exposed to Tucker Carlson before making a decision. We also do, all the same types of robustness experiments, ruling out confounds and so on. We do on the side too, but I'll skip for the interest of time. And again, we do a similar inference experiment among, about the participants from that experiment. So again, since we're interested in more liberal people judging conservatives for being anti-immigration, we recruited a sample of Democrats and independents, which we think are the ones who would be more judgmental against this. So the same intervention with about 1,000 participants. Each respondent was matched with the previous survey participant, and we showed the two versions, the two tweets, right? One or the other, just the screenshots. And we asked them, what's their willingness to deny bonus payment to that participant? First thing you notice, pretty high, right? This is Democrats and liberals being told that someone posted a tweet to deport all illegal Mexican immigrants. So 80% here are just like burning, just I don't want that person to get a bonus payment. So clearly there's a lot of antipathy toward that person, right? It's not surprising. But we still find that it works as a cover. I mean, it's against all odds. Like, you pretty much hate that person for what they're doing. But they saw Tucker Carlson before. Maybe, just maybe, they're not a racist. Maybe they're just persuaded by Tucker Carlson. You know, maybe they believed it. And it works. It reduces your willingness to deny bonus payment. I was surprised because I thought these people were pretty inelastic. But we find this here. Okay? And then, again, we asked them, and then your question is, I think, is even more relevant here. Instead of saying donation against immigration, we asked their beliefs about the probability they donated to a pro-immigrant organization. But notice, this is pro-legal immigration, so that's different, because otherwise it would be very weird, right? But again, the baseline is pretty low, 8%. It's like, oh, that person just signed a petition to deport all illegal Mexicans, right? They're probably against immigration, but you know, so they might be in favor of legal immigration, right? So 8%, and they still we find a significant increase here in this inference. So it seems to work here on the inference side about your motives. Also seems to work, and likewise, when you use open-ended text analysis of unprompted responses, we find similar patterns of people changing the way they make inferences about the motives. So. So those are the two sets of experiments, the main sets of experiments on both sides of the political spectrum. I think it's interesting because we isolate this mechanism and also go deeper on kind of inference, right? How people think about the motives of the other person. Then, of course, there's some concerns. I don't know how much time I have. 10 minutes. Okay, good. We also run experiments because, of course, some concerns, like, it's cool, you guys did this on Twitter, it's kind of a real decision and so on, but, you know, there's issues about external validity, right? It's not the largest samples, it's selected population, people with the survey provider that have active Twitter accounts and were willing to download the app and so on. So that imposes some selection criteria. Doesn't affect internal validity, but you can ask about external validity. So we also have the same types of experiments on the Republican side, on the conservative side, with very big samples. We actually did two. We did one, and then we replicated it. This is so close to 5,000, over 5,000 observations, so large samples throughout the country, just to show that these things really work. And there, the experiment's not on Twitter, and the outcome is instead the willingness to make a publicly observable donation to an anti-immigrant organization after being provided with a crime rationale. Here, this is actually how we started the paper back in the day. But we thought that the Twitter stuff would be much more compelling. But we have that, and instead of using Tucker Carlson, we used a study written by John Lott, arguing that immigrants commit much more crime than natives. So we use that as the cover. And we see, again, a significant increase in the willingness to make a donation when they have provided with a cover, with a similar design. Interestingly, since they think that this is going to be observed in their area, in their city, we actually find larger effects in counties with higher Democratic vote share. So if you're a Republican living alongside Democrats, you're much more likely to need a social cover. I mean, it has a much bigger effect than if you're a Republican living alongside Republicans. Of course, it's not random assignment, but it's consistent with the idea that I need a cover if I'm dealing with Democrats or independents. But if I'm around other fellow Republicans, I might not need the cover so much. Again, we also run the additional inference experiment with a large sample of 3,000 Democrats, and we find fairly similar result on people shifting how the inference they make about the motives of the other person. So we are able to replicate this again and again with different types of samples, which gives us kind of confidence that we're actually getting what we think we're getting. Okay? So I actually have time to discuss some of the implications and kind of next steps. So we showed here the rationales facilitate dissent, that respondents on both sides of the political spectrum are more willing to express dissent when they can appeal to a rationale. Okay, so holding fixed whether they are exposed to the rationale and whether they think the audience will be exposed, just the fact that they can evoke the rationale, they can say, oh, I saw this, actually seems to matter a bunch. These rationales also change social inferences about the motives behind dissenting. People impose lower social sanctions on dissenters and are less likely to ascribe their behavior to stigmatized motives when dissenters can appeal to a credible rationale. Okay, so this is what we see on both sides of the political spectrum. Now, I think there's kind of some interesting implications. For example, when you think about political correctness, in a discussion of political correctness, you know, the idea is that certain arguments or rationales cannot be voiced because they might legitimize dangerous or undesirable causes. So you basically make it like such that anyone who voices it is seen as supporting the cause. So it's kind of to silence a group. So how you do it, right? And so in this case, you could be in a situation where rationales actually fail to shift the inference and they can actually backfire, which is like, oh yeah, I know why you're saying this. I know why you're using this evidence. It's because really you are a racist. That's why you're saying this. You know, this is an excuse. You're using that. So that's something that can happen, right? So individuals or institutions seeking to suppress dissent can therefore, one, they can undermine the credibility of rationales directly by saying anyone who evokes this has an agenda behind it. You know, this is kind of not a very credible rationale. You shouldn't use it, right? So that's one way to remove this power of the rationale to facilitate dissent. Another thing that can be done is to manipulate the real, the perceived correlation between the knowledge, the rationale, and the underlying type, which I think is kind of pretty interesting, right? Because in our experiment, this is not something we're manipulating because people say, I was shown the article, right? There's no treatment where you say, I found the article, right? So it could be interesting if when you say that you found, it works less well because it, oh yeah, you found it. What were you looking for, right? So the inference about your type could be different if instead of being exposed to the article, you actually found it. And people can use this, like institutions and individuals can actually say, well, if someone looks for that, if someone finds this type of sources, it must be that they are of this bad type. Okay, so that's something that can be used also to shift on silence groups, right? So I think there's kind of some interesting kind of extensions, both theoretically and also experimentally to be studied. And then one potential, say, just to think about some implications, like when you think about debunking fake news, right? It might not be enough. If part of the reason why people are using stories is to provide them with social cover, then it might not be enough. Suppose you want to post something on social media, and it's kind of not reliable, the source. It's fake or whatever. And then Facebook sends you a little message, say, be careful, this has been challenged, don't post it. If they send it privately, it might not be enough because the audience doesn't know that you know that it's not legit, right? You could say, well, I posted, oh, I just didn't know, right? Now, it might be crucial to tell the person that it's going to be common knowledge among your followers that you were debunked to remove the social cover, right? So it might not be enough to just do it privately. You might say, hey, we're telling you, and your followers will know that you were told, right? You might need this additional step. So, so we've been in touch with both Twitter and Facebook to tweak their kind of like fact-checking approach to actually add this aspect of, you know, of common knowledge to see if they can do it. Because the general equilibrium effect of debunking could be much larger than the partial equilibrium effect because, you know, through this common knowledge aspect, yeah. And they're just like publicly. Yeah, I saw in which elections. A lot of the what happens now is still also with just like getting you like a little warning before you post, right? Without emphasizing that, yes, your followers will know that you've been, you know, are you sure you want to post this because it's been challenged? But you could say, hey, and your followers will know that we gave you this heads up, right? They don't have this additional step. Yeah. So, all right. So that's it. Thank you.
So, are there any questions?
A quick one, out of curiosity. So did the cover tweets get more likes or retweets as well?
Yes. the thing. They were not posted.
Ah, it was all the screenshot that you were showing to this
Yes,
other.
because- exactly, because
Then it's not quite the public forum I was thinking of when you were.
no. We told them, and maybe I was too quick. He said, we tell them, we have access to the Twitter account through this app, and we say, do you authorize us to post this on your account? We'll do it if and when we reach
All the count
participants. Yes. And since we never did it, we never posted. But at that moment, they thought
They
we
knew
would-
that they were going to be
yeah,
going
they
to go
thought
public.
Yes, they thought, but we just it's interesting. I mean, there's also this aspect of the social multiplier that unfortunately we're not studying here, which is like, you silence a person and then you silence the next one and so on. But we couldn't measure all these additional steps because we're not actually posting. So we're walking this line between, the ethics, and kind of the interesting aspect.
Oh, no, very
We
cool.
could have
Thank
studied,
you.
Yes.
What share of people who were exposed to the videos decided to join the campaign? I mean, was it larger for liberals on the more conservative
It's the other way
case,
around.
or-
So they joined the campaign. So privately joining the campaign happens before seeing the article, right? So this condition on seeing the article, right? And then I think it's about half conditional on seeing actually join without the cover. About half, 40 something and 50 something. Yeah, on both sides. That's about. Okay. Wait, you had a question, Kate? Change your mind. Yes.
In terms of the implications, is there anything to be done here in terms of regulation of Twitters or the social media? What do you learn from this exercise in the end? So it's interesting, It's
Yeah, I mean, the debunking of fake news is one, right? The other one is about this aspect of, how, institutions, like what institutions, individuals, or groups can do to kind of suppress or silence a group by basically challenging the credibility of rationales or implying that finding a rationale says something about you. It kind of informs us on the strategies that groups can do, right? So I think those are some things we learned. And it's interesting, too, that if the reason why people are silenced is because they can't initially kind of express their views without justification, then you want to make sure there's actually no credible justification people can use, right? One might be enough to just trigger a whole movement, right? So it's kind of interesting. You really want to make sure every corner is kind of cut, because otherwise if people agree that, oh, this is valid, we can all use it, and then you can start a whole campaign, a whole movement, and things can unravel. So there's some interesting dynamic implications in terms of political economy, I think. Yeah.
Quick question. Maybe I misunderstood it. So to try to isolate this mechanism from sort of a more just a pure identity-based mechanism, if it was Hillary Clinton as opposed to Tucker Carlson saying that immigrants are horrible and they should all be sent back, in your story that should lead to a bigger effect, no?
Depends. Yeah, it could be, right? I agree. It could be that. There's no reason. First of all, for the second one, you mean? First of all, it would be weird to say, why is she saying that?
No, but that's my point. Yeah.
And the question is, would you actually believe that? But the interesting thing, notice the lack of symmetry here. We did not try to lower the bar on the Republican side, right? And that's kind of interesting because Tucker Carlson works pretty well, right? We saw that on the Democrat side, an opinion piece in the Washington Post, without saying that it's a principal professor with scientific evidence on the tweet, already doesn't work. Now, the Republican side will be interesting to see, okay, could it be that evoking scientific evidence actually flips, it makes it worse, or or citing a Democratic candidate. Those are interesting questions.
Yeah, something at the intended margin would be very
Yeah,
nice.
would be interesting, to study. I agree. Over. Thank you. Thanks.
Teste som, alô, 1, 2, teste.
Mas
Okay, should we keep going? The third speaker of today, Konstantin, we are happy to have you. If you have any question, please raise your hand so Isabel can bring you the microphone and then give it back to her. Otherwise, people who is online cannot really listen to the questions, okay?
Thank you so much. So the paper is joined with 3 co-authors of mine, David, Fabrice, and Joe. Now, basically, we're moving on from like identified problems where there's some heterogeneity in people, how they post things, with an N of 500 to an N of like 150,000. Okay, so there's not going to be identified via an experiment or so forth. So there's no identification here. We're just going to try to kind of assess heterogeneity. So the motivation, this paper is basically about the US mortgage market. Just as a preview, the US mortgage market runs on fixed rate mortgages, 30-year fixed rate mortgages that you are free to refinance. So what you can do is if your rate that you're paying is too high and the rate currently is lower than that, you can basically refinance at a relatively modest cost. Okay, so effectively there's a growing body of work that shows, however, that households are really bad at refinancing. They're like actually considerably suboptimal, and there's a huge kind of difference in the cross-section. So some people are actually reasonably good, like my co-author Joe has refinanced 5 times in the last 6 years. So he's really good at refinancing. And there's other people who basically are really bad. This paper is basically trying to measure this heterogeneity and kind of talk about the consequences of this heterogeneity. So effectively, there's cross subsidies from the mortgage market, mainly because the US government subsidizes the mortgage market, which leads to pooling for mortgages. So effectively, even though if the lender could figure out if you're like kind of smart, kind of, you know, like Joe, my co-author, or if you're like someone who never refinances, the mortgage market usually does not try to monetize that. Mainly because the US government subsidizes a part of the mortgage market, and the US government pays for certain characteristics, and they just don't pay for differentiated characteristics in a way that would make this profitable. Now, we're going to look at basically the cross subsidies, and we're going to look at the impact of mortgage contract design and what we here call financial literacy programs, really programs that try to make people refinance more optimally. Okay? Bigger picture is really, if you think about wealth inequality basically comes from idiosyncratic income, idiosyncratic return on assets, but also idiosyncratic rates paid on liabilities. And so really today is about number 3, that there's basically, for most American households, and I suspect for most households in most of the world, the biggest liability you'll ever have is your mortgage. And it really matters what rate you pay on your mortgage, and if there's a huge difference on that, that can lead to kind of wealth inequality on its own. All right, today we're going to look at a low-dimensional equilibrium in mortgage pricing model that basically allows for heterogeneity on the household side. We're going to evaluate the cross-subsidies between the different households due to this pooling, and then we're going to do counterfactual calculations trying to think about increasing financial literacy or just removing frictions that keep people from refinancing, this overcoming suboptimality and the contract design. Left aside, we're not going to do any spec pool pricing. That there's a bunch of data, how people price these assets after they've been issued. We're going to kind of do an approximation to the full stochastic PDE. That's just in the interest of just being as transparent as possible and having a tractable model. And we're not going to quantify the monetary policy pass-through. Okay, so the preview is really, we're going to have this tractable mortgage pricing model, and we're going to measure refi propensity, refinancing propensity, I'm going to abbreviate as refi, in a large panel data set. And we're going to find there's substantial heterogeneity. Then we're going to calibrate the model with the pricing. And then basically what we can show is that there's roughly 10% of the mortgage balance. So if you have for each dollar of mortgage that you have, there's effectively a cross-subsidy of the fastest to the slowest borrowers of roughly 10% MPV over the lifetime. So this is a huge cross-subsidy between basically whatever you want to call the slow people and to the fast people. And we can cut the data in a few different ways, and then I'm basically, if you FICO is the credit score, high FICO people basically got a cross-subsidy from the low FICO people, or people with more than one mortgage seem to be kind of on average more attentive or more optimal in refinancing than people with only a single mortgage, and that basically accounts for roughly 2.5%. We're going to do some counterfactual analysis. Slowest households are hurt if their attention improvement is effectively less than the average. And then we're going to talk about automatic refinancing mortgages that have been suggested by policymakers to remove this cross-subsidy, but it's going to lead to uniform higher initial rates. And then there's basically a trade. All right. Let me skip the related literature. Dan Gottlieb actually has a paper on this, which is effectively life insurance has cross-subsidies from early behavioral lapses to households that see the contract through. So we're going to have a similar behavioral story, but our model is more dynamic in the sense like most of the pricing is going to come from a dynamic model, and so it's significantly different. So the economic setting, think about we don't have any pricing measure. We assume that the probabilities are just P and Q coincide. So there's no risk premium anything here for today. And we're going to assume a CIR process for the interest rate. So that's basically a Cox-Ingalls-Ross process that stays away from 0. We can add more dimensions if we wanted to, but that's just really our kind of baseline. Now, mortgage market investors here, we have homogeneous risk-neutral investors. So they are the people who buy the mortgages after they've been originated. And they're going to be, they're discounting at that short rate, that kind of moved around. That's effectively our source of aggregate risk here, this Brownian motion shock. And we're going to have capital is elastically supplied at that. So there's no kind of frictions in the sense that banks run up against some constraint or something like that. We're going to have investors offer mortgages at a rate M of T at a given state, and which is determined equilibrium, and investors here are competitive. What that means is they're going to make zero profit. You can put an I/O model on top of this. It gets pretty messy. You think about a Star 89 paper, but we're going to do the we're going to do the zero profit version. All right, you're going to have households. Households here need to borrow for housing, take out a unit size $1 perpetual mortgage. So this is really a simplification. Now most mortgages, of course, have a maturity. We're going to assume that they move at an exogenous rate nu. And you can think of this as essentially including default risk and contractual maturity. So effectively, all that we need is that everyone who has a mortgage...
Konstantin,
yeah.
Sorry. What are PNQ in the previous slide? You said that... What are PNQ? I just missed it.
Oh, that's the physical probability for asset pricing. That's physical probability and risk neutral probability. So we just assume everything is physical. I should have just left it out and no one would have asked any questions. So, all right. So effectively, we're going to have, the only assumption is that when you have a mortgage, you keep taking money out of the house. You keep remortgaging your house. So you never pay off your house fully. That's effectively the model. Of course, we can let people die, and then someone else has a mortgage for the house, so this is really an approximation. Now, the most important thing is they always have one mortgage outstanding, so this is not really a model of housing choice. You just have your house, you live in it. And the most important thing, they pay attention to the financial market at Poisson times at an individual persistent rate chi. So that was our baseline assumption. I'm going to talk just in a second what we mean by chi. The mortgage contract is a fixed rate mortgage that has basically a coupon that was fixed at whenever it was taken out. So if you entered your mortgage in, say, 2020, you have a mortgage rate of 3% in the US. If you take it out right now, it's more like 4.5%. So it really, M star really just tracks the time at when you took out the mortgage. There's no option to prepay. We're going to assume it's costless, so to get rid of all the option pricing that if it costs you like $3,000 to refinance, you might want to wait until the gap is between the rate that you can get and the rate that you're paying is large enough. Now, I'm going to tell you what this kind of attention friction essentially makes this more tractable. We can talk about later how much we're off by basically the refinancing. Households optimally refinance when there's a positive mortgage gap. That is when the rate that they're paying M star is higher than the rate they could currently get in the market. And this is optimal as long as chi is persistent or chi changes, maybe, but it's uncorrelated with their refinancing decision. All right, we're going to have we can think about two models. There's our AER paper in 2021, basically has no attention heterogeneity. There's a single type, you all pay attention with result chi, and you can derive this thing basically in closed form. There's a pricing function M that is a function of the current interest rate R and the attention parameter. Now with attention heterogeneity, what matters is the joint distribution at any given state. So in 2020, there's certain cross-sectional distribution of outstanding mortgage rates in the population. And of course, there's a joint distribution with respect to who the kind of fast versus slow guys are. And so that distribution actually is a huge mess because it's a joint distribution that basically moves with the aggregate state of the world. Now banks expect to face a certain cross-section. So if this is the current distribution that they're facing, of course the high chi guys pay more attention. So if the bank charges a certain rate M, they get a certain cross-section of attention rates that are trying to refinance. So in that sense, if mortgage rates are going down, most likely you're facing a pool as a bank that's going to be more attentive than when rates are going up. Okay. They conjecture household refinancing behavior, and that affects the evolution then of FT, which in turn affects future pricing, and this is where the messiness starts, because now
you have to forecast future cross-sectional distribution because they establish future prices, and future prices are the thing that determines if people are going to refinance or not. Okay? Zero profit is basically a fixed point in a mean field game with aggregate shocks. Now, if we have basically a stable cross-sectional distribution of types in the population, that is, the people who pay attention are kind of a fixed proportion of the population, that makes this whole thing quite messy. So effectively what we're going to do, actually let me just give you the interpretation of chi, and then I'm going to tell you how we're going to kind of try to approximate this with a more tractable model. The interpretation of chi is really, first of all, if old school, like if you think about old school economic models, they usually would say, let's just put a fixed cost in there. It costs $2,000 to refinance. Is the question? Okay, so basically it costs $2,000 to refinance. This is a terrible assumption if you want to actually match the data. The data is there's people who basically don't refinance even though they would have huge gains from refinancing.
It's just a question. So in the zero profit condition, but these banks would they like to impact this Poisson arrival rate? Is there money to be made if their policy, like advertising campaigns, are calling you up like, hey, you know, you could do this and this?
Exactly. So in this model there isn't. In reality there is, because you're going to get a small fee from refinancing. So in the last few years, kind of them kind of bombarding you with refinancing offers has gone up. Now the problem is that they bombard you with refinancing offers the same way I get spam calls. I used to live in Massachusetts, and I get spam calls that say, you should refinance. I don't own a house, and I don't live in Massachusetts. So most of the bombarding is kind of not very informational. If the bank that you originated the mortgage with calls you, maybe that is more informational. But the other way, it just seems to be a lot of spam. Right. Yeah.
Let me ask another question. So if instead of being old school and take a fixed cost, we are super new school and we take a rational attention approach, and then we think about the attention probability is related to the saliency of the event, and so I pay attention the more distant is the current option on the market from the one I'm paying. For example, because my colleagues talk about it at lunch, oh, just refinance my house because rates are great now. Would that...
Yeah, that's essentially what the chi is trying to catch.
So, but the chi is dependent on my M and the market M, or the chi is just...
No, here the chi is unconditional. You can think of more involved models where the chi kind of represents aggregate conditions.
Right.
Maybe like after 3 years of falling rates, your chi is going to be higher than that. We're not going to account for that.
I was just, okay.
Yeah, but exactly. So the chi is basically a catch-all for non-monetary frictions, effectively attention or awareness of market conditions. We're going to assume that's unconditional. Now, it's not only that. There's people, we all know this, people who hate writing referee reports on time. Like, you know, we all procrastinate. But there's people, I have colleagues who all write all their referee reports on time. So there's definitely, given that we're all pretty educated and we can probably all figure out mortgages, there's still this other element, mental effort to fill out forms, procrastination, and so forth. And then finally, there's this thing which in the US is often talked about when you think about minorities. There's a dislike of interacting with mortgage bankers. Maybe they treat you like shit because, you know, you come into the bank and they're like, you know, like I come in with a suit, they're nice to me. I come in with long hair and like look like disheveled. They're like, who are you? All right. So we're going to do a simplifying assumption. And I'm going to give you two interpretations of the simplifying assumption. First, we're going to assume banks correctly assume that the agents are reset at prepayment to some constant distribution G. So effectively, we're going away here from persistent heterogeneity to saying whenever you refinance, you're redrawn from the chi distribution. And households follow the rule of thumb when they refinance. Now, I previously said it's optimal to refinance when you can get a lower rate. That's not the case under this assumption anymore because there's some optionality in keeping your high chi status if you think that the rate is going to drop further. The second assumption, second interpretation is bank incorrectly assumes that agents are reset and that they follow this rule of thumb, whereas in reality, households chi is persistent. Both of these things, assumptions basically cut through having to track this whole full cross-sectional distribution, which is going to be kind of a mean field game with aggregate shocks, which we all know is virtually impossible to solve unless for small noise expansions. So we're going to do an approximation. The rule of thumb is mildly suboptimal, but it really only is the suboptimality is really strong in really high interest rate environments, which we don't really have a lot in the data. Okay, we're going to have this tractable mortgage pricing model. Effectively, this is the thing that I want you to concentrate on. There's a profit from each mortgage that you issue that is the discount or premium from the dollar, from its face value. So if everyone were the same time issued, mortgages would be issued at par. They would have a mortgage rate that exactly makes the value of the mortgage go to 1. Now what happens in reality is that there are some people you're going to make money on and some people you're going to lose money on. You're losing money on my co-author. You're making money on, say, Joe the plumber versus Joe the academic because Joe the plumber doesn't refinance. On average, you want to break even, and that's basically that condition. We're going to calibrate the short rate process, and now let me talk about the data. Here we're going to have attention heterogeneity. We have CRISM monthly data set for, I guess, 230,000 individuals from 2000. We're going to assume a uniform moving propensity of kind of 4% a year. And we're going to observe monthly refi decisions, cash out decisions, purchasing the mortgage. We're going to observe your credit score, your current loan to value ratio, your principal balance, your mortgage rate gap. That is the mortgage rate you most likely would have to pay if you refinance today. We can see a bunch of characteristics, and so we know if you have a better credit score, you pay a slightly lower rate. So we're going to account for that, and we're going to basically fold all this mortgage rate into a mortgage rate gap. We're going to do a main data restriction. You might have concerns that households may exogenously be prevented from refinancing. What that means is that here we're going to have a monthly observation is included if your loan-to-value ratio is below 80%, the FICO is above 675, and the balance is above 50,000. These two are basically, would you be able to refinance? The balance being large enough as would it be worthwhile for you to refinance? And we're going to exclude 2008 to 2010. We don't observe employment status, and you might, even if you fulfill all these requirements, if you just lost your job and the bank knows this, they might not refinance you. Okay, so the ratio of interest for us is, for each household, for each I, we're going to observe how many periods would have been beneficial to refinance. Let's call them the effective periods. In effectively, periods in which the gap would have been larger than some x, here we take 0.5%. In the model, strictly speaking, it would be 0%. We know in reality you probably need a bit more to get moving. And we're going to assume how many times did you actually refi in those months. And so just to show you basically, we're going to have, this is the data. There's a few people here who actually, they had 2 periods where it was effective. They refinanced in 2 periods. They get a 1. And what you can see is there's a bunch of people who never refinance. So even though they had a bunch of periods in which they would have been optimal to refinance, they didn't. Just to show you this in estimated CDF form. So this starts at 75%. So effectively, roughly 3/4 of the sample never refinances, even though it would have been optimal to do so. And as you can see here, depending on the gap, you can have a lower CDS is, of course, higher propensity to refinance. And so effectively, we're going to have a slight difference here. All right, so the next thing we're going to look at is, well, these are observations by household. We want to think about the banks. People don't have a unit-sized mortgage. So effectively, we want to weigh basically the people by the mortgage they take out. Because for a bank, they issue dollars. They don't issue to a unit-sized mortgage to everyone. And so when you weigh that, you can see people pay more attention. That's basically because there's a correlation between higher mortgage balances and higher attention. All right. Then I'm going to show you one of these splits, and then we can basically talk a bit about what the model implies. What's the split going to show you is the difference in the CDF if I were to split the sample into above median credit score to below median credit score. And so what you see here is that if you have a higher credit score, you on average pay attention, or it's the first order stochastic dominance argument basically. So people with a high FICO pay more attention than people with low FICO in a first-order stochastic dominance sense. That's not for the zero gap, but for the red and the green gap they do. Similar results hold for splitting the sample by loan amount, splitting the sample by if you have multiple mortgages outstanding at any given point or just a single mortgage. So it might be you have two mortgages, you have your own home, and you have a rental property somewhere. But it does not work for a loan-to-value ratio. Okay, so just to keep that in mind. We're going to transform this into intensities. So this now ranges from 0 to 5. And again, this is all data estimated CDF. The next thing we're going to do is we want to reduce heterogeneity down. Our model basically requires us to solve on a matrix, so we can't just put in a cumulative distribution function. So what we do is we do a maximum likelihood. I can show you here, if you have n equals 1, you estimate basically everyone pays attention at 0.013 or something like that. But now, as you introduce more and more data points, you basically approximate the CDF. Now, one of the important things is maximum likelihood estimation treats a 0 out of 2 differently than a 0 out of 20. Because a 0 out of 20, it's very expensive to not adjust the probability of 0, whereas 0 out of 2, a probability of, say, 0.1 is not as expensive to put in. Okay, so just to, afterwards, if maybe during question time, it's not clear what the optimal grouping is. This is basically machine learning. How do you optimally reduce the size of heterogeneity to something tractable? And there's a few methods we can use. I'm going to stick with 5. N equals to 5. It gives me an estimate that there's basically 80% who never pay attention, 6% who pay attention once every basically 4 years, if you 1 over 2. And then basically there's 1% of people who pay attention like once every 2 months. Okay, so just do the inverse of chi basically gives you the expected time between refinancing, between attention events. Yeah.
Does the date at which people got their initial loan matter? Because, you know, some people may have gotten a loan in a world in which interest rates were very low, and they stayed kind of low for a long time, so refinancing was not part of the lingo of their, you know.
Oh, you mean like they never had to refinance, so they never really thought about it, so they never learned how to refinance?
Right, it wasn't the thing. Well, instead, if you refinance already once, because you see what I'm saying? Like, if you live in a period, if during your tenure you had incredible swings,
yeah,
you want to do it, and then once you've done it a couple of times, you might just as well do it 4.
That's right, that's right. So here it's very, so some time fixed effects will pick that up. Here it's really hard because our heterogeneity is basically a lot of zeros. So we can't really cut the data.
In that way, I see.
Yeah. I mean, we should think harder about that, but at the moment I don't really have a good answer.
What I was thinking is that you may want to, for example, plot, you have types, right? So you can look at these types in this n equal to 5, and then you can see how their date, original date of thing.
Yeah, I could do that. Yep. I can actually, the identifiers are running numbers, so I could just give you the average of their running number,
right.
And if they have a higher running number, that
it's going to tell us something about.
That means they're later. Yeah. So now with these 5 data points I just showed you from the maximum likelihood estimation, we're going to plug them into the model with the interest rate process to basically think about pricing. So the first part was basically thinking about data heterogeneity. Now, hopefully I convinced you that there's some heterogeneity in the data. Not everyone acts the same. Now, what that means is that what is on this graph? We're going to have the horizontal axis. We have the interest rate. The pink curve in the background is basically the steady state distribution of the CIR process. So you're going to spend most of your time around 3%. And you're going to spend some time at 7.5%, but you know, out here it's basically you're unlikely to go to 10% interest rates. The dashed black line is going to be our mortgage pricing in the heterogeneous world. If you had homogeneous agents, that is, everyone just had the average attention rate in the population, which is 0.184, you would get the gold line. Now, why is there a difference? The difference is that the fast guys don't stay in the mortgage for very long. whereas the slow guys stay in the mortgage actually a lot longer than the average. So effectively, there is a difference in duration that basically changes the pricing. If we were to give people the mortgage they deserve, in the sense that the mortgage that their type, if you could differentiate on type and could discriminate on type, you get all these different colorful lines. And you see that the blue line is relatively to the dashed line. The blue line is the completely inattentive people, and again, that's 80% out by our estimation. But then, like, the Joes of the world would have to pay a significantly higher interest rate. So we can think about this in terms of the subsidy, we can take the difference, and basically you see there's substantial subsidies in terms of the rate space, okay? And so basically, investors break even on the current mortgage, but that doesn't mean that the households are staying in there at the same time, the same duration, and the equilibrium consequence is basically some households provide large cross-subsidies to almost all other groups in terms of type-dependent investor MPV per mortgage. Yeah. Or because of the setup, so Humberto asked, why don't the banks try to differentiate them? First, attention is really hard to differentiate on because, as we all know, we might all be procrastinating, even if we have like certain characteristics. The second thing, the US pooling equilibrium via the Fannie Freddie housing market does not pay for that. So even if I manage to originate a certain mortgage, I don't really get that much additional. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so effectively now, this is the cross subsidies in the rate space. So here at the average interest rate, basically you have 1%. Joe, my co-author, should pay 1%, 100 basis points more than he's paying, basically for most of the mortgages. And effectively in the MPV space, if you take the average of this over the distribution G, you basically get the zero profit condition. And you see that the slow people are the only people who basically lose money, and banks make money off the slow people, and they lose money on pretty much everyone else. Okay, so now the next thing is, let's think about inequality. How many minutes do I have? Like 10 or 15? Okay. So let's think about kind of mortgages as a driver of inequality. So effectively, single largest liability for a household over their life. Differences in rate can be quite substantial then in terms of how much they affect your wealth. And even when there's no price discrimination at origination. So we are really excluding already that maybe there's some discrimination when you take out the mortgage. People just, you walk in, they're like, this guy is not very good at getting good mortgage pricing, let's give him a terrible rate. We're going to exclude that. So everything here, all the differences come from dynamic suboptimal behavior. And so slower groups pay larger average coupons over time. So here, suppose we started with our estimated pool, suppose we started in 2005, and we just followed these people through 2021. So that's a falling interest rate environment for most of it. And this is basically the average coupon they pay, and you can see that the really fast types have a substantially lower average coupon than the slow types. And so that was basically what our model implies. Here's a paper that basically does this with a bunch of microdata. So there's a paper by Girardi, Will, and Zhang. And the US housing market basically has an anti-discrimination law that requires everyone to register when they make an offer, the race and other characteristics of borrowers. It's called HMDA. And basically they use this, and one of the factors they use, they basically use race. And what they say is that Black and Hispanic white borrowers face challenges refinancing because on average, they have lower credit scores, equity, and income. But even after you control for this, you can see that basically there's still a difference in prepayment behavior. So just to show you the graph from their paper, on the left, this is basically you start in 2005, and you basically just follow by here racial category. It's just one characteristic that's observable. Of course, we would like to have other characteristics in the data set, but that's just one that the law requires to be disclosed. So that's an easy one to follow. And what they can show is that even if they remove all discrimination at origination, so they give everyone when they refinance the average rate, you can see that there's basically black borrowers pay 50 basis points more than what comparable white borrowers as you go through from 2005 to 2014. So now the question in our data is, we have a bunch of data, we don't have racial characteristics or anything, we have FICO, we have LTV. Now what you might want to wonder is, how much heterogeneity do you need between groups to generate 50 basis points? So let's first take maybe FICO, like above median FICO, below median FICO. When I plug that into the model, I can at most generate 18 basis points difference. So the heterogeneity that seems to be inherent in the, kind of, if you think about the left side, seems to be larger than the FICO heterogeneity. The only heterogeneity that kind of measures it is if you have multiple mortgages or not. So multiple mortgage owners pay so much more attention that, or pay attention at a differential rate high enough to basically get you to the 50 basis points on the left. So that's just telling you something. We're not trying to match the left. I'm just trying to say how much heterogeneity does a model need to include to give you differential effects like what you observe in the data. All right, so now, how big are these cross-subsidies? We kind of talked about. So then the next question is, how big are the cross-subsidies? And effectively, we're going to look at lifetime MPV per loan, assuming counterfactually that you're a persistent type. So everyone around you switches, but you are a persistent type. And of course, we can kind of, that's one, and we can also look at the organic average coupon that you're going to pay. The first one here, this is basically, if you're a persistent type in the pricing that assumes kind of resetting, Joe basically, over his lifetime, gets a let's just pick here the average rate here, gets a 15% basically subsidy on his MPV. So for each dollar he pays, he has to pay basically the equivalent of 85 cents. Whereas if you're a slow borrower, you basically pay the equivalent of 103 or 105 cents for your mortgage over your lifetime, rolling over. So that means that effectively there's huge cross-subsidies in the model that extend past the current mortgage. So the whole thing is, quick people leave the current mortgage quickly, and so we need to account for all the dynamic effects. On the left, you're going to have effectively what each of these groups pays as an average coupon. Of course, the slow people pay a higher average coupon. They pay a higher average coupon than even the homogeneous setting. And then, of course, the fastest people pay a low average coupon. The next one is, let's think about not differences. So the differences here are by type, but we can't really identify type that easily. So we don't have any characteristics on type. We know there are some slow people out there, but we don't really know who they are. What we know is, however, that the distribution, say, cutting by FICO or cutting by multiple mortgages, that is based on an observable. And so when we plug that in, if you have a high versus a low FICO, you have a lifetime MPV difference of roughly 1%. If you have a high if you have multiple versus single mortgage holder, at the kind of mean, you have a lifetime difference of roughly 2.5%, 3%. And so these are substantial cross-subsidies that are flowing through the mortgage market. Now the next thing is, people are kind of, policymakers want to address that. And how do they address it? They want to basically have policies that reduce the barriers to refinancing. Here is essentially improving the CHI distribution. Now think about this as maybe financial literacy or maybe kind of other frictions. Maybe, getting banks to not treat you as badly when you come in, or basically getting people off the procrastination train, which might be harder. But suppose you can change the distribution, then effectively how do we discipline that? We're going to discipline that by basically saying we're going to shift you from, say, observed below median to above median distribution. So effectively we want to have some discipline on the model. Here this is the value of the current mortgage to the household. So if you're Joe, you're gold. A mortgage at the moment, for each dollar you make 1.8 cents. That's the net value of this mortgage because of the refinancing option. If you're the slow guy, you lose money. What are the dashed lines? The dashed lines is basically what changes to the pricing when we shift everyone to the more attentive cross-sectional distribution. What happens? Everything moves down. The pricing moves against you. That's the basically equilibrium effect here. As people get more attentive, you're going to get worse rates. What that means is if you are one of the inattentive people that after whatever intervention is still inattentive, you're worse off. So in effect, if you think as a policymaker you want to get people, you know, to refinance more, effectively you're going to make some people worse off if they're kind of if their improvement is below the median attention improvement in the economy, basically. And that's also borne out by the lifetime MPV. This is persistence over the life. This is on the single mortgage that you take out at the moment. Now, the next one, basically, we can do here, this one was basically shifting from below FICO median to above FICO median. That's a relatively mild improvement. The bigger improvement would be moving from single mortgage to multi-mortgages. And then you can see the attention improvement really moves the pricing against the inattentive guys. So if you're still inattentive, after that improvement, you're really screwed. Now, finally, let's think about an automatic refinancing mortgage. If you know Harris Holmstrom paper on labor market wage setting, that is basically the equivalent in the opposite direction. So effectively, your mortgage, without you having to do anything, is going to adjust to the lowest rate over the life of its life. What you get here is, let's go back to the original graph I showed you. The dashed black line was the mortgage pricing that you get in the heterogeneous case. If you have a homogeneous case with the same average attention rate, you get the gold line. And basically, what's the teal line here? That's chi equal to infinity. That's the automatic refinancing mortgage. And what you see is you get much more steepness, and you're going to get that it never crosses the 45-degree line. That's because it has a downside option. But what that means is effectively, well, first of all, there's more monetary policy pass-through. If you move R around, you're going to get a lot more differences in M. But what that also means is that you're going to have higher initial rates. So for every initial rate R, the mortgage rate that you have to pay at the initiation of the mortgage is going to be higher. So it's unclear that this is actually a benefit to everyone. Now let me just walk through this. Average mortgage rates over the life of the mortgage are lower, because over the life of the mortgage is going to go down as the interest rates move around. But the initial rate is going to be higher, and so if chi is negatively correlated with the likelihood of financial constraints, suppose you buy houses because you can barely afford the monthly payment. Then effectively you can't buy the house anymore you want, because you are basically constrained, because the initial, even though you can, my example would be you can drown in a pool that's on average 10 inches deep. That's the same here. On average you pay a lower rate. That doesn't mean that you can afford the initial rate. And so that's basically one. And so effectively you might ask yourself, is there going to be unraveling? We're going to introduce this new mortgage product that is automatic refinancing. Are the traditional 30-year fixed-rate mortgages, are they going to become extinct? In a fully rational model without any other financial constraints, yes. Because the lowest chi's know I'm paying a cross-subsidy. Let me get into the automatic refinancing mortgage that by design does not have any cross-subsidies. As they move out, the pricing in the traditional market adjusts, and the lowest guys left are the ones screwed, they leave, and so forth. What's the obstacle to unraveling? Well, the first is what I just said, the financial constraints. I just can't afford the initial rate. And so I go, even though I know I'm paying a cross-subsidy, I'm basically paying for liquidity. I'm basically willing to pay a bit more to have a lower rate today, even though on average I'm going to lose. But the second point kind of goes back to the maybe behavioral interpretation here. Some households may have a hard time understanding the dynamic properties. Now, I can all tell you it refinances according, to the minimum of the rate. Then you're going to have a view of the minimum of the rate. And for some households, that might be really difficult kind of mental calculation to make. And so it's unclear that even introducing this mortgage that would probably help the worst types, kind of the slowest types, it's unclear that the market would completely shift to that. And who's going to shift is also unclear. So let me just wrap up. So we have a tractable mortgage pricing model where we measure refi propensity in a large panel data set as the input to the pricing. We're going to find large heterogeneity in the data. Calibrated models suggest that there's significant cross subsidies, roughly 10% of mortgage balance over the life of the agent for the fastest versus slowest household. We can't tie that to any characteristics. Trying to tie it to characteristics, we're going to get roughly 75 basis points for below above median credit score, and 2.5%, 250 basis points for basically the attention difference between multiple mortgage holders versus single mortgage holders. And then we analyzed, financial literacy might be the wrong word, maybe just trying to shift the distribution up. It's either financial literacy if you think this is attention. It might be other things like reducing frictions that are non-monetary for another interpretation of Chi. And then basically the main thing here is that even though this is better on average, most inattentive households, if they stay inattentive, are still screwed. So that's, I think, the takeaway here. All right. Any questions? There's a few questions here. When we start in the back and then.
So I have it might be related to Humberto's question.
Yeah.
So it's about the role of public information and proxies for attention. So you had a zero profit condition that's inducing all the cross subsidies.
Yeah.
But if you had public information about, say there are two groups, high FICO and low FICO, and I don't understand this market enough, but maybe you could condition the contract on that, so we should see zero profits for each of the two groups, and we shouldn't see a lot of cross subsidies flowing across groups, or actually any, in this specification of the model, right?
So you're asking why is there pooling? So there is pooling because the US government decides to subsidize this market, and the US government pays prices that are not market prices. So the US government has a matrix that says if you're the mortgage originator, we're going to pay you a certain amount if you originate a mortgage with a FICO of like 750 and a loan to value ratio of 80%. So maybe, and there's mispricing in that matrix. So clearly there's some mortgages which you want to sell to the government and some mortgages which you don't want to sell because there's mispricing. Some things are juicy to sell to the government, some are not. What we observe in reality is that most mortgage originators actually don't hold any mortgages on their books. Effectively, the liquidity that the government provides by buying these mortgages off their hands and providing the default subsidy seems to swamp any kind of market segmentation that you're imagining. Now, in other countries, that might not be the case. So in the UK, maybe in Brazil, I don't think there's a kind of federal subsidy for that market that induces this mispricing that then gives you kind of your argument, why don't these guys cut the market
up? Let me make a political economy twist. Suppose that I follow your last slide, what you did not recommend to do, which is suppose we do automatic change, automatic adjustment. Here's another concern. Political economic implication, enormous political pressure to lower interest rates. Right? Because now everybody will get their mortgage go down. So that would be completely unsustainable.
Well, there's still the price is still set by private investors. So it's unclear.
Fair enough, but the central bank has quite a...
Exactly.
Right?
So
So what I mean is that then you really need super strong independence of the central bank.
Yeah.
Kind of like your ECB as opposed to Fed.
Exactly. So monetary policy is also going to be more path dependent. So effectively after like 2020, if we had automatic refinancing
you're done.
mortgages,
That's it. This generation is
at
good
their
forever.
min. No one would whatever the Fed does has no impact on the refinancing channel because everyone is already at their min. So you're completely right that in environments in which we basically came out of long, high-rate environment, there's a lot of political pressure there. I completely agree. Any other questions? Right.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Konstantin.